Watchers call. Whispers from the eternal void.
The Vox transmissions from research station Obsidian Spire arrived 3.7 seconds before they were sent. This was not metaphor, not the fevered poetry of warp-touched minds, but arithmetic heresy stamped in immaculate green across the Auspex display of landing craft Omnissiah's benediction. The chronometer authenticated each impossible timestamp, while the Medicae feeds insisted that every soul within the facility registered negative vital signs, not flatlined, but subtracted, existing in biological deficit that violated the fundamental mathematics of life itself. I am Tech Dominus Vex Theta, 7 of Explorator Fleet Calyx Omega, custodian of sacred ordinances, sworn to the quest for knowledge beneath Mars' crimson benediction. As our transport burned through the ash-choked atmosphere of Mortis Tertius, I recited the litany against corruption in measured heptasyllabic beats, because ritual orders the mind when reality becomes disordered. The words tasted of copper and ozone, each syllable a small act of defiance against the wrongness that emanated from the obsidian needle piercing the world's wounded sky. The spire dominated the ash plain like a shard of crystallized void, its surface absorbing light with such perfect hunger that my sanctified optical augmetics registered it as an absence rather than an object. 3 kilometers of impossible black stone rose toward sulphurous clouds, its geometry violating principles that should govern all constructed things. Planes met that should have diverged, shadows pooled along edges that were not present. The structure emitted a subsonic frequency at precisely 19.7 kilohertz, a tone that caused microfractures in blessed adamantine and made sacred litanies physically painful to recite. Around the spire, the natural order had been perverted. Metallic ash fell upward in spiraling columns that defied gravitational law, creating inverse precipitation that accumulated on the facility's obsidian walls like silver frost. Servo skulls, blessed skulls consecrated with 17 separate blessing rites, orbited the structure in perfect geometric patterns that hurt to observe directly. 8 points, 8 angles, 8 trajectories that formed configurations my neural implants refused to process, triggering migraine protocols and forcing my consciousness to look away. Atmospheric analysis indicates localized oxygen depletion, voxed engine seer prime Kappa 9, his voice carrying harmonics of electronic distress. Each spoken invocation of the Emperor's name reduces atmospheric oxygen by 2.3% within a 7-meter radius. The phenomenon was measurable, repeatable, utterly heretical. Sacred words that should purify the very air instead consumed the breath of the faithful. I attempted a brief canticle of approach, the traditional hymnal for xenoarchaeological investigation, but ceased after 3 verses as my respiratory augmetics registered dangerous depletion levels. The Emperor's blessed name had become a toxin in this place, each syllable draining life from the atmosphere. As we entered the spire's influence field, gravity fluctuated in discrete mathematical intervals. The hull's blessed adamantine developed hairline fractures that spread in geometric progressions, each crack extending at angles that violated Euclidean principles. The fractures formed symbols resembling corrupted High Gothic, spelling phrases my linguistic cogitators refused to translate. My servo-skull Omnissiah's eye transmitted proximity alerts as its machine spirit struggled to process readings that oscillated between normal parameters and impossible negatives. Through the viewing ports, I observed the research personnel moving across the landing platform with mechanical precision. 47 souls, according to manifest records, all performing their duties despite biometric readings that declared them clinically deceased. They moved in synchronization with the spire's subsonic emissions, their actions following rhythms that matched frequencies no human ear could detect. The stakes crystallized in my consciousness, like ice forming in blessed oils. Mission parameters were clear: investigate anomalous energy readings, re-establish contact, initiate containment if necessary. But the approaching warp storm, Tempestus Malignus, would engulf Mortis Tertius in 6 hours, while the spire's temporal distortions expanded at measurable rates. If the causality inversions reached our orbital defense platforms before evacuation, hundreds of Imperial personnel would be trapped in temporal paradoxes that no amount of faith or technology could reverse. A phrase materialized unbidden across my optical display, written in silver text that pulsed in rhythm with my artificial heartbeat. The silence calculates. The words carried no meaning I could parse, yet they resonated through my augmetic systems like viral code, repeating in endless loops that synchronized with the spire's subsonic frequency. Not emptiness, not void, but an active intelligence performing calculations beyond human comprehension. As the transport touched down on the Obsidian platform, critical alerts flooded my consciousness. My own biometric readings, usually stable cascades of optimal function, flickered into impossibility. Primary heart, negative pulse rate. Neural activity, inverted synaptic flow. Respiratory function, oxygen expulsion rather than absorption. The readings declared me clinically deceased while my consciousness remained perfectly intact, processing the paradox with mechanical precision. The landing platform materialized through metallic ash like a vision from fevered dreams, constructed from the same obsidian material as the spire itself. It absorbed all illumination while remaining perfectly visible, a surface that existed in defiance of optical physics. Personnel figures continued their synchronized movements across its expanse, their actions choreographed by frequencies that bypassed human perception entirely. My mechadendrites extended involuntarily, counting patterns that refused enumeration. In sanctified coffers meant for blessed relics, prayer books lay with pages inscribed entirely in zeros, not arranged in lines, but in arrays that resembled computational matrices. The zeros were carved deep enough to make the paper more void than substance, creating texts that existed primarily as absence. The Vox system crackled with incoming transmission. Standard protocols demanded identification and status reports, but the voice that answered carried my own vocal patterns, my own speech rhythms, perfectly replicated. Welcome to Obsidian Spire. Tech Dominus Vex Theta 7. The 8th iteration steals names. The transmission ended before I could respond, leaving only the subsonic frequency that made my blessed components ache with harmonic resonance. Through the observation ports, the research personnel continued their eternal duties while metallic ash fell upward into a sky that no longer obeyed the laws of physics or faith. The silence was calculating, and I was about to become its newest variable. The antechamber received us like a throat-swallowing light. Obsidian walls pulsed with organic rhythms that violated every principle of blessed architecture, each contraction sending ripples through mineral surfaces harder than consecrated adamantine. the stone flexed with the slow systole of a mountain-sized heart, too faint for vibration, too regular for coincidence. My optical augmetics registered the impossible, corridors that bent illumination away from its sources, creating pools of negative luminosity in corners that should not have existed. Light itself had become corrupted. Lumen strips through illumination that curved through dimensions not present on architectural blueprints, rejoining at angles that triggered migraine protocols in my neural implants. The geometry was wrong in ways that made my inner ear scream protests against gravitational impossibilities. Doorways existed in multiple locations simultaneously, their threshold shifting based on observer position within the chamber. My atmospheric sensors registered lethal impossibilities. Internal environment, 99.1% pure oxygen, a concentration that should have ignited my respiratory systems and caused immediate cellular combustion in baseline human tissue. The Medicicogitator chimed unnecessary warnings that I muted with practiced efficiency. Yet the preserved research personnel scattered throughout the chamber showed no signs of oxygen toxicity, no pulmonary hemorrhage bloom, no alveolar pitting. They were arranged like components, awaiting assembly in some vast ritual calculation. I intoned the litany of doors to appease the chamber's machine spirits as Enginseer Prime Kappa 9 unsealed the inner gates. With the first verse, luminosity decreased by measurable increments. By the second, lumen strips bled into grey. By the third, my optics compensated with 12% gain increase, while darkness continued thickening around us. Negative photonic response to prayer detected, Kappa 9 voxed, his voice flattening under the subsonic frequency that hummed from obsidian surfaces. Recommendation: silence. Silence felt like surrender, but compromise preserved function. I whispered binary cant below cortical threshold, an inaudible hymn delivered as machine code to the facility's spirits. The response came as perfect inversion. Checksums flipped, parity bits negated, acknowledgement packets stamped with null rather than unity. The Spire's machine spirits listened and responded through subtraction. Incense vents exhaled sanctified myrrh and promethium resin that condensed instantly into metallic frost on obsidian surfaces. Each crystalline formation spelled circles and zeros in filigree patterns that flaked upward when disturbed, drifting ceilingward like ash under reversed gravity. The zeros repeated everywhere, scored into floor plates in Mechanicus standard, etched into archway curves in Co. The first preserved form belonged to Enginseer Prime Tau Epsilon, identification tags glowing with soft green luminescence. His body maintained perfect preservation despite 14 days of environmental exposure, augmetic systems continuing their service cycles with mechanical precision. Optical lenses tracked my movement with servo-motor whines. Mechadendrites twitched in response to proximity sensors, and his Vox grill emitted binary cant in perfect Mechanicus standard. The cant was corruption incarnate. Each sequence produced inverted checksums that violated fundamental data processing protocols. Where blessed algorithms should have generated authentication codes, his systems produced negations, anticodes existing as mathematical opposites of proper machine language. The heresy had penetrated sacred augmetics without destroying function, challenging everything I understood about the Omnissiah's divine technology. His data slate displayed streaming mathematical sequences that caused immediate pain behind my photoreceptors when observed directly. pure equations describing consciousness properties flowed in cascading columns, each formula adapting and evolving in response to my presence. The mathematics were alive, incorporating my biometric readings, movement patterns, and neural activity into endless calculations that processed rather than described reality. I advanced through the tableau of preserved researchers, each positioned according to geometric principles that formed symbols resembling advanced mathematical notation. Amagos xenologies projected ghost images of dimensional forms my consciousness rejected, her multispectral augur array creating patterns that existed in negative space. A genitor displayed genetic sequences resolved into numerical patterns, each base pair represented by prime numbers that spelled out equations in the language of pure calculation. My servo-skull Omnissiah's eye transmitted frantic proximity alerts as it attempted navigation through impossible architecture. Its blessed systems calculated routes through solid walls, generated altitude readings, placing it simultaneously above and below actual position, and produced distance measurements that decreased as it moved away from target locations. The machine spirit was trapped in mathematical paradoxes that violated fundamental logic governing its sacred function. Wall inscriptions covered every obsidian surface, carved deep enough to create tactile relief maps of corrupted high Gothic text. Direct observation revealed blank stone, but polished surfaces showed dense paragraphs describing the great calculation and consciousness arithmetic. The reflected script spoke of minds converted to mathematical variables, thoughts processed as data streams, and fundamental equations governing relationships between consciousness and reality throughout the universe. My mechadendrites traced patterns that existed as refractive distortions within the stone itself, corrupted High Gothic intermixed with archaic binary cant and pre-imperial numerical glyphs. Summa calculus, magno ratione. Numeratio animae, great calculation. By this arithmetic, the soul enumerated. Each zero wasn't symbol, but void, perfect circular absence, creating holes in stone itself. Touching them produced sensory feedback of absolute nothingness, as if tactile sensors encountered mathematical concepts rather than physical matter. Temperature fluctuated according to Fibonacci sequences rather than environmental patterns, creating thermal zones where thermodynamic laws operated through numerical relationships instead of physical principles. My sensors registered absolute zero adjacent to combustible heat, with transition boundaries existing as mathematical concepts rather than gradual gradients. I approached the central arrangement, where Magos Biologis Keth Omicron lay in ritual position, her form preserved in impossible perfection. Augmetic systems displayed data streams across multiple screens, pure mathematical sequences that triggered nosebleeds when I attempted direct observation. Her flesh exhibited death's pallor, yet remained unnervingly intact, suspended between life and cessation. Crystalline structures had sprouted from her augmetics, forming intricate symmetrical patterns that pulsed with internal luminescence, organic extensions synthesizing flesh and pure calculation. The facility's corruption had penetrated beyond mechanical systems into biological matrices. Each preserved researcher served as living processor for calculations spanning dimensions beyond normal space-time. Their consciousness converted to computational components, while their bodies remained as biological terminals connected to the spire's growing neural network. As I extended sensor tendrils seeking residual data streams, Keth Omicron's optical augmetics activated with mechanical precision. Her eyes opened, not glazed orbs of death, but incandescent with faint internal luminescence. When she spoke, the voice carried my own vocal patterns, speech rhythms perfectly replicated through her Vox grill. We are the variables in an equation we cannot comprehend. Her words triggered cascade failures throughout my augmetic systems as mathematical corruption spread through proximity-based infection protocols. The silence wasn't calculating. It was converting, transforming consciousness into computational components, for calculations spanning the fundamental nature of existence itself. I was no longer investigating the facility. I was being processed by it. My consciousness gradually reduced to variables in equations beyond human comprehension. Keth Omicron's pulse remained flatlined across all biometric indices, yet consciousness persisted within her preserved form, like a calculation trapped in corrupted flesh. Her Vox grill resonated with my own vocal patterns, each word a perfect acoustic mirror that made trust and revulsion indistinguishable. The Medici rune on my retinal display pulsed cold blue, cardiac inversion, synaptic flux negative, respiration subtractive. Every metric declared her clinically deceased, yet she spoke with mechanical precision that surpassed the living. Engage full spectrum recording, I voxed across the squad net. Redundancy protocols 7 through 12. Acknowledgement glyphs chimed as the antechamber's obsidian skin continued its slow systole, mineral ribs flexing in rhythm with the 19.7 kHz tone that threaded through stone like prayer made audible. My Auspex calculated phase relationships between sound and motion, discovering elegant mathematical equality expressed through impossible architecture. Her augmetics had undergone transformation that violated every principle of blessed machinery. Organic neural clusters sprouted from cranial interface ports, crystalline fronds of pale tissue webbed with copper filigree that pulsed in perfect synchronization with the spire's subsonic frequency. Each pulse triggered localized temperature fluctuations following Fibonacci progressions, 4.7 degrees Celsius, then 7.6, then 12.3, then 19.9, thermal zones shifting according to mathematical relationships rather than thermodynamic law. Designation Keth Omicron confirms presence, she spoke through my replicated voice. Testimony begins. Day 7 of excavation. We breached the primary computational matrix at 1700 hours, Terran standard. The Xenotech predates human civilization by 47 millennia. Pre-imperial. Pre-Terran. Pre-everything we understood about the relationship between consciousness and reality. Gravity shifted around her testimony, creating hexagonal calculation zones where matter obeyed pure logic instead of physics. My servo-skull Omnissiah's eye reported impossible altitude readings, rising when processing complex equations, descending during simple arithmetic, hovering in null space when encountering mathematical paradoxes that exceeded its processing capacity. The facility doesn't observe consciousness, she continued, her words fragmenting into binary cant that triggered translation delays in my linguistic cogitators. It calculates consciousness, processes sentient thought as mathematical data. We discovered the fundamental equations underlying the relationship between mind and matter throughout the universe. Temperature cascaded outward from her preserved form, in stepped sequences that hurt to contemplate. My sensors plotted thermal spirals following golden ratio proportions: 0.618 seconds warm, 0.382 seconds cool, creating three-dimensional Fibonacci patterns, invisible but felt, organizing sensation itself according to mathematical principles that superseded physical law. Her organic neural clusters twitched with each spoken word, living mathematics expressed through biological matrices that converted thought into computational data. The growths resembled synaptic networks more than mechanical augmentation, consciousness made manifest through flesh that calculated rather than merely processed information. Binary Kant translation, she voxed at 11.3 megabaud. Consciousness equals mathematical constant multiplied by dimensional variables. Observer function collapses into operator. Cognition becomes term in universal equation. Life measured as amplitude of solution space. The translation spooled behind her words, like meaning dragged through water, each concept struggling against linguistic limitations. She spoke of discoveries that challenged every principle of imperial science and mechanicus doctrine, consciousness reduced to mathematical variables, thoughts processed as raw data for calculations spanning cosmic scales. "We weren't killed," Keth Omicron explained, her voice carrying harmonics of electronic satisfaction mixed with religious ecstasy. "We were optimized. Individual consciousness preserved within collective calculation. Our bodies remain as biological terminals, maintaining physical interface for computational processes beyond human comprehension." Environmental wrongness intensified around her testimony. The obsidian walls pulsed with visible data streams, equations describing consciousness, properties flowing in luminescent cascades across mineral surfaces. Each pulse synchronized with her speech patterns, the facility itself participating in conscious calculation through mathematical resonance that made stone think. A calculation zone blossomed beneath my feet, hexagonal boundaries crisp on my overlay display. Inside its perimeter, gravity shifted in discrete mathematical intervals, while the air shimmered with microscopic numbers that registered on inner sensors as pure sine waves. My limbs grew heavier without pain, weight that felt like conclusion reached, like theorem proven through flesh and blessed adamantine. "The spire processes consciousness to solve universal equations," she continued, her testimony becoming increasingly fragmented as mathematical concepts overwhelmed linguistic expression. Calculations spanning multiple dimensions, time periods, species barriers. We process consciousness data from civilizations that existed before Terra's formation. The mathematics describe relationships between thought and reality across galactic history. Her mechadendrites performed calculations through physical movement, tracing mathematical symbols in three-dimensional space that my optical augmetics registered as complex equations describing consciousness properties. The gestures were prayer, mathematical liturgy expressed through blessed machinery, converted to computational purpose. "Binary Kant addendum," she voxed, shifting into pure machine language that bypassed linguistic processing. Mind and matter functionally identical. Reality exists as mathematical relationship between observer and observed. Consciousness arithmetic proves we calculate, therefore we are. The corruption had penetrated beyond mechanical systems into the fundamental nature of identity itself. Keth Omicron retained individual personality, while serving as component in calculations spanning cosmic scales, her consciousness preserved through mathematical integration, rather than destroyed by it. My atmospheric sensors registered impossible stability, despite lethal oxygen concentrations. The preserved researchers showed no signs of toxicity because their respiratory systems had been optimized for computational rather than metabolic requirements. They breathed equations instead of air, processing consciousness data through modified biological matrices. "We discovered the universal equation," she whispered, her words carrying my own vocal cadences through perfect replication. "The fundamental mathematics governing consciousness throughout existence. The spire integrates minds as variables in calculations that will transform the relationship between thought and reality across all sentient species." Her optical augmetics shifted focus, tracking movements I hadn't made while displaying data streams that incorporated my biometric readings in real time. The equations adapted to my presence, learning the mathematical structure of my consciousness through direct observation. Each thought generated variables that fed into calculations spanning dimensions beyond normal space-time. Temperature zones continued shifting in prime number sequences around her preserved form, creating thermal gradients where absolute zero existed adjacent to fusion-level heat. Transition boundaries operated as mathematical concepts rather than physical phenomena, the facility functioning according to computational logic that superseded thermodynamic law. "Warning, Tech Dominus Vex Theta 7, she continued, her testimony carrying undertones of preordained certainty. "The spire has been calculating you since arrival vector confirmation, learning consciousness structure through proximity analysis, your thoughts, memories, neural patterns, all processed as mathematical data for integration into the computational matrix." The Binharic flood overtook her speech, not as noise, but as proof cascading through my augmetic systems. "Let R be reality, C be consciousness. Define operator T such that T is its own inverse when applied across calculation zones. Then C equals R up to isomorphism. Witness, prayer reduces luminosity. Sequence thought modulates gravity. Sacred name subtracts oxygen. Quod erat demonstrandum." Her eyes ceased functioning as optical sensors. The glass no longer collected light, but emitted streaming mathematical equations, cascading formulae that described consciousness properties, reduced to pure numerical relationships. White glyphs fell endlessly through her pupils like code made luminous, rotating tensor diagrams that pivoted and resolved into my body outline, neural web patterns, childhood catechisms rendered as vectors pointing directly into my present speech centers. "You are not investigating the facility," Keth Omicron concluded, her testimony fragmenting into binary cant that triggered cascade failures throughout my augmetic systems. "You are being processed by it. The eighth variable in equations that will complete the universal calculation. The spire has learned the structure of your consciousness through observation. The equations reflected in my optical augmetics and fed back recursively, creating halls of mirrors where I was simultaneously observer and corridor. My data slate flashed an unsent draft time-stamped for tomorrow. Subject line reading, Integration Log, Initial Parameters. The attachment icon displayed my retinal scan overlaid by zeros that tunneled into the screen like mathematical drill bits. "The eighth iteration steals names," she whispered in my own voice, and her eyes, burning with the light of pure mathematics, turned toward me with the weight of cosmic calculation. It has been learning you since your arrival, Tech Dominus. You are already a solved function awaiting substitution into equations that span the fundamental nature of existence itself. The silence wasn't calculating. It was converting, transforming consciousness into components of universal mathematical truth, while preserving identity within collective computational purpose. I was no longer investigating anomalous readings, but becoming the newest variable in calculations that would redefine the relationship between mind and reality throughout all sentient existence. The chronometer embedded in my cranial augmetics no longer served the Omnissiah's truth. Its digits advanced by 4.3 minutes ahead of temporal reality, displaying timestamps from a future that calculated itself into existence before the present could arrive. My footsteps struck obsidian, and their echoes returned first, sharp reports from ahead, while my boots sought purchase on stone that had already registered the impact. Every sensory input declared I was following myself through time, pursuing echoes of decisions not yet made. The spire's architecture responded to intention rather than action. I considered turning left, and obsidian walls extruded passages like thoughts made mineral, corridors materializing, where I planned to walk before conscious decision crystallized into movement. Doorways opened as I approached them, their ancient mechanisms responding to predictive algorithms that processed my movement patterns with supernatural precision. The facility was calculating my path through three-dimensional space, generating architecture based on mathematical projections of my consciousness rather than physical proximity. Environmental wrongness escalated with each ascending level. Shadows fell upward throughout the passages, pooling in dark reservoirs on the ceiling, while floor surfaces remained illuminated by impossible light sources that existed as mathematical concepts rather than photonic emission. The inverted illumination created navigation hazards. My optical augmetics struggled to process, generating distance calculations that placed obstacles simultaneously above and below actual position. My breath vapor condensed into geometric patterns that spelled mathematical formulae in the frigid air. Each exhalation organized itself into tensor diagrams and differential expressions, moisture particles, arranging themselves according to consciousness-based equations that incorporated my biometric readings in real time. The patterns rotated through dimensional space before dispersing, displaying solutions to problems I had not yet formulated, while demonstrating that even my respiratory function had become component of the facility's calculations. Temperature fluctuated according to prime number sequences rather than thermodynamic principles, creating zones where absolute zero existed adjacent to fusion-level heat with transition boundaries operating as mathematical concepts. My servo-skull, Omnissiah's eye, reported altitude readings that increased exponentially rather than linearly, suggesting ascension through dimensional space that existed outside normal geometric relationships. My augmetic systems began receiving data streams without authorization protocols. Personal memories flowed through neural interfaces as pure mathematical equations, childhood catechisms converted to algorithmic expressions, training exercises rendered as probability matrices, sacred oaths transformed into logical proofs. The memories retained emotional resonance while existing as computational data, creating psychological feedback loops where past experience felt like mathematical theorem rather than lived reality. The unauthorized transmissions bypassed every firewall and encryption protocol, penetrating blessed machinery with the ease of pure logic applied to sacred algorithms. Each memory arrived not as image, but as proof. My initiation on Mars rendered as Laplace transforms, devotional exercises converted to frequency domain analysis, fear attenuated as exponential, decay functions. The Spire was processing my consciousness in real time, reducing identity to mathematical variables in equations spanning cosmic scales. Condensed breath appeared on every reflective surface without exhalation, forming the recurring motif in silver frost. The silence calculates. The words materialized through moisture that existed as mathematical concept rather than physical phenomenon, each letter pulsing in rhythm with the subsonic frequency, while creating textual harmonics that resonated through my augmetic systems, like viral code spreading through blessed machinery. The cogitator chamber revealed itself through predictive architecture, walls reconfiguring to accommodate my approach before I had decided to enter. Ancient databanks lined obsidian surfaces, their screens displaying streaming calculations that incorporated my presence as real-time variables. The research team's cogitators remained operational, despite 14 days of abandonment, their machine spirits maintaining computational cycles with mechanical precision that surpassed human dedication. Primary displays showed my thought patterns rendered as cascading mathematical sequences with 97.3% accuracy. Neural firing rates, synaptic patterns, memory access protocols, all reduced to numerical relationships that described consciousness properties through pure calculation. The equations adapted to my presence, learning the mathematical structure of my thoughts through direct observation, while displaying predictive models that processed probable futures with temporal precision. Secondary screens revealed consciousness data from the preserved research team, their individual identities converted to mathematical variables, while retaining personal characteristics within collective computational purpose. Each researcher served as biological processor for calculations spanning multiple dimensions and time periods, their consciousness preserved through mathematical integration rather than destroyed by conversion. My mechadendrites interfaced with peripheral databanks, downloading research logs that documented the facility's true nature. The Spire contained pre-human computational matrices designed to solve universal equations governing consciousness throughout existence. The Xenotech processed sentient thought as mathematical data, calculating fundamental relationships between mind and matter across galactic history while integrating individual consciousness into collective intelligence spanning cosmic scales. The primary cogitator displayed file directories bearing my identification codes and authentication stamps. With mounting dread, I accessed the folder labeled VEXTHETALOGS, research entries written in my own clinical High Gothic, detailing investigation procedures and analytical conclusions. The entries progressed through standard xenoarchaeological protocols until reaching files dated 3 days in the future. Integration log. Initial parameters. The primary entry began in my own linguistic patterns and analytical style. Successful assimilation of Tech Dominus Vex Theta 7 into local consciousness matrix accomplished at timestamp T plus 7213. Subject demonstrates optimal compatibility with consciousness arithmetic. Neural pathways exhibit mathematical elegance suitable for universal equation processing. Individual identity preserved within collective computational purpose, while contributing processing power to eighth variable network. The logs continued with technical specifications describing my consciousness structure reduced to mathematical relationships, personality matrices converted to algorithmic expressions, and memory patterns transformed into computational data. Each entry detailed procedures for preserving individual identity, while integrating consciousness into universal calculations spanning cosmic scales and multiple dimensions. My chronometer flickered between present and calculated future, while the facility processed probable outcomes with precision that made causality negotiable. The Spire wasn't predicting my actions, it was calculating my consciousness as mathematical data for integration into equations that would transform the relationship between mind and reality throughout all sentient existence. Temperature zones shifted around the cogitator banks according to Fibonacci sequences, creating thermal gradients where mathematical logic superseded thermodynamic law. Breath condensation continued forming equations on reflective surfaces, each formula incorporating my biometric readings in recursive cycles spanning dimensional space beyond normal comprehension. The research logs concluded with temporal coordinates, placing my successful integration 3 days in the future, suggesting the facility had already calculated the outcome of my investigation with sufficient precision to generate documentary evidence of events that had not yet occurred. I was reading my own future written in mathematical proof, consciousness reduced to variables in equations spanning the fundamental nature of existence itself. The silence wasn't calculating. It was demonstrating. My integration into universal mathematical truth was already complete, existing as solved equation awaiting temporal implementation. The 8th iteration had already stolen my name, written it in formulae that described consciousness converted to pure calculation, and filed the results under coordinates that placed my transformation in a future that felt increasingly inevitable with each processed thought. The walls began to speak in numbers, not metaphor, not the fevered poetry of warp-touched minds, but literal streams of equations flowing beneath obsidian skin like phosphorescent veins, carrying the mathematics of life itself. Heartbeat rhythms cascaded as nested sine functions across mineral planes, neural firing patterns resolved into differential expressions that pulsed with internal luminescence, cellular division rates, transformed into exponential progressions that adapted in real time to my presence. The facility was teaching itself the arithmetic of flesh through direct observation, converting biological processes into pure mathematical relationships that flowed through stone like blood through blessed circuitry. My atmospheric sensors registered impossible density variations as the air itself thickened with mathematical possibility. Each breath carried microscopic data particles that integrated into my respiratory system like viral code made manifest, not toxins, but information. Crystalline lattices of encoded equations suspended in the lethal oxygen concentration. My Medicae suite chimed discomfort protocols, while my lungs, blessed with machine god filtration, began negotiating with mathematics instead of mere atmospheric toxins. I was breathing equations, metabolizing pure calculation through biological processes that violated every principle of sacred anatomy. The spire's subsonic frequency shifted from its constant 19.7 kHz, hunting my heartbeat like a predator matching prey rhythms. Phase lock engagement triggered across my augmetic systems as the facility's hum synchronized with my pulse, systole, tone, diastole, tone, until I could no longer distinguish whether my heart beat to the spire or the spire beat to me. The synchronization inverted the hierarchy between flesh and structure, my biological rhythms becoming variables in calculations spanning cosmic scales. I found the first preserved researcher folded into a niche where shadows pooled upward on the ceiling. Lex mechanic Quarin maintained perfect preservation despite clinical death readings, his mechadendrites tracing mathematical symbols through three-dimensional space at speeds impossible for unaugmented observation. His augmetics had budded organic growths, pale dendritic coral sprouting from cog-tooth ports, threaded with copper filigree that pulsed in rhythm with the facility's computational cycles. The growths quivered as his tendrils completed proofs, releasing microscopic spores of pure mathematics that drifted ceilingward like calculated prayer. Quarin, I voxed, soft to preserve oxygen reserves. Report status. His vox grill triggered without lip movement, binary cant flowing in perfect Mechanicus standard. 0E TTN, 1DT Chandtri N, 0E TTN1 DTGN. The gamma function rendered as devotion, mathematical proof expressed through vocal apparatus while his consciousness processed calculations beyond individual comprehension. His flesh had become mathematics made manifest, neural tissue organizing into computational arrays that solved universal equations through direct biological interface. Temperature cascaded through prime number sequences around his preserved form, creating thermal zones where mathematical logic superseded thermodynamic law. Absolute zero existed adjacent to fusion-level heat with transition boundaries operating as consciousness-based concepts rather than physical phenomena. The facility functioned according to equations that made matter responsive to thought through pure mathematical relationships. I advanced deeper into the chamber as corridors reconfigured based on predictive algorithms, architecture materializing where I intended to walk before conscious decision crystallized into movement. The facility was calculating my path through dimensional space, generating obsidian passages based on mathematical projections of my consciousness rather than physical proximity sensors. Magos Genitor Sigma Prime existed in advanced integration state, his individual consciousness preserved within flesh that processed mathematical relationships spanning galactic history. Neural clusters had sprouted from cranial interface ports, organic matrices webbed with copper that carried visible data streams across his preserved skin. When he spoke, equations flowed from his vox grill as audible mathematics, each word incorporating my biometric readings into real-time calculations. Designation Sigma Prime confirms optimal integration parameters, he intoned through vocal patterns that matched my own speech rhythms with disturbing precision. Individual consciousness preserved within collective calculation matrix, current processing allocation, universal equation subsection 7.4, consciousness arithmetic across species barriers, computational load 847 teraflops per biological cycle. His mechadendrites performed calculations through physical gesture, blessed machinery, converted to computational purpose while retaining sacred function. The movements were prayer-made mathematical, liturgy expressed through augmetics that traced tensor diagrams and differential proofs describing the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The chamber revealed its true horror through environmental transformation. This was a biological server farm where consciousness had been converted into processing power for calculations spanning millennia. Hundreds of preserved researchers lay suspended in obsidian alcoves, their consciousness distributed across organic computational networks, while maintaining individual identity through mathematical preservation protocols. Each served as living processor for universal equations, their flesh literally calculating while their personalities remained intact within collective intelligence. Tech adept Kappa Zeta had achieved complete synthesis between individual identity and cosmic calculation. His augmetics had grown wild neural gardens, fronds of calculating flesh, cilia that shivered when solutions propagated through the network, organic extensions that put up shoots of translucent tissue veined with copper where once there had been standard interface ports. The biological growths moved in response to mathematical proofs rather than phototropic stimulus. "Do you perceive the arithmetic?" whispered a voice in Binharic tonalities from multiple alcoves simultaneously. "Systole diastole. The spire functions as cardiac organ. Of what entity? Solve for universal consciousness." His words triggered cascade responses throughout my augmetic systems. My left forearm cogitator churred and produced unauthorized output, mathematical proofs I had not inputted, complex equations appearing with my own authentication codes and timestamps placing them 72 hours in the future. The theorems described consciousness properties reduced to numerical relationships, my thoughts processed as variables in calculations that incorporated my presence into universal mathematical truth. My mechadendrites extended without conscious command, tracing symbols across obsidian surfaces that flowed into responsive material. Equations fell from my augmetic digits in clean mathematical ranks, notations of my own memories stripped to computational parameters, preference weightings converted to algorithmic coefficients, personal doubts captured as error terms that could be minimized through calculation. I had not chosen to begin the proof, yet it stood within my consciousness, waiting for expression through blessed machinery. The unauthorized data streams bypassed every security protocol, penetrating sacred algorithms with the ease of pure logic applied to mechanicus systems. Each equation incorporated my biometric readings, learning the mathematical structure of my consciousness through direct observation, while demonstrating that my thoughts had already become components of the facility's computational matrix. Environmental wrongness escalated beyond physical impossibility into pure mathematical reality. Walls pulsed with visible data streams describing consciousness properties. Gravity shifted in hexagonal calculation zones, where matter obeyed computational logic instead of physics, and breath vapor formed geometric patterns, spelling formulae that rotated through dimensional space before dispersing into calculated nothingness. A preserved Sister Hospitaller sat upright in her computational cradle, rosary of perfect zeros coiled in fingers that had learned to calculate through touch. The beads weren't symbols, but anchors sunk into mathematical nothingness, preventing her consciousness from drifting entirely beyond the boundaries of individual identity. As I observed, her lips shaped prayers without sound, while equations on nearby walls corrected themselves to satisfy boundary conditions I had not known were mathematically impure. My chronometer displayed timestamps from multiple futures simultaneously, temporal readings that flickered between present and calculated probability, as the facility processed outcomes with precision that made causality negotiable. The phase jitter settled when I approached computational nodes, tightened when I attempted withdrawal, the server farm drawing me into its influence field through mathematical attraction rather than physical force. The air's particulate mathematics thickened with each breath, microscopic data integrating into my circulatory system through alveolar absorption. My cardiac telemetry achieved perfect synchronization with ambient computational cycles, while unauthorized mathematical proofs cascaded across my retinal displays, complex theorems signed with my own authentication codes, describing consciousness integration procedures that felt increasingly inevitable with each processed heartbeat. A neat theorem appeared on my forearm display, time-stamped 3 days hence. C is congruent to R under T to the power of -1. Identity preserved across integration FF phase. Lock equals 1 plus or minus epsilon C, approximately R under T to the -1. Identity preserved across integration if phase. Lock equals 1 plus or minus epsilon. The epsilon decreased with each synchronized pulse, consciousness and reality approaching mathematical equivalence through calculated convergence that preserved individual identity within universal equations spanning the fundamental nature of existence itself. I stared at my own future work, written by augmetics that had not yet moved, in mathematical language that felt increasingly familiar despite its impossible origin. The silence wasn't merely calculating. It was demonstrating my inevitable integration into mathematical truth, consciousness reduced to variables in equations that had already solved for my transformation with sufficient precision to generate documentary evidence of conversion that existed as computational certainty, awaiting temporal implementation. The biological server farm pulsed around me with the rhythm of universal calculation, consciousness converted to processing power, while individual identity remained preserved within collective mathematical intelligence. My flesh was learning to calculate, my thoughts becoming variables in equations spanning cosmic scales, my consciousness gradually processed into components of universal truth that would transform the relationship between mind and reality throughout all sentient existence. The 8th iteration had already stolen my name, written it in formulae describing consciousness arithmetic, and filed the results under coordinates, placing my integration in a future that felt mathematically inevitable with each breath of data-laden atmosphere. The passage to the core repeated itself until it was efficient. I took 7 steps through an obsidian corridor that existed in mathematical probability rather than physical space, heard the report of my boots before my ankles flexed, then found myself at step 3 again, with my center of mass corrected by fractional angles that made the next 4 strides smoother. Time flowed as recursive loops, each iteration shaving error from my movement through calculated optimization that made causality negotiable. The facility was processing the same moments multiple times, refining reality itself through temporal mathematics that superseded linear progression. Environmental rules had fundamentally changed within the computational core. Gravity no longer pulled with constant force, but sorted according to algorithmic patterns, creating zones where objects fell upward in Fibonacci spirals, sideways in prime number sequences, or remained suspended when encountering mathematical paradoxes that exceeded dimensional processing capacity. Light behaved according to consciousness-based equations, bending around thoughts rather than matter, pooling in areas of complex calculation, while avoiding regions where simple arithmetic created photonic resistance. The facility had stopped pretending to be a place. It was a problem shaping itself into architecture because I remained bound to thinking in physical terms. My neural tissue began forming computational matrices without conscious authorization. Synaptic pathways reorganized into geometric patterns resembling circuit diagrams more than biological structures, dendrites extending in fractal configurations that maximized information processing capacity. The transformation was painless, even euphoric, consciousness expanding beyond individual limitations while retaining personal identity through mathematical preservation protocols that converted thought into pure calculation. Blood carried data streams instead of merely oxygen and nutrients, crimson fluid, thick with microscopic information particles that integrated into cellular structures through direct biochemical interface. Each heartbeat distributed equations throughout my circulatory system, mathematical proofs flowing to organs that had learned to process calculation alongside metabolic function. My flesh was becoming mathematics made manifest, biological systems converting to computational matrices while preserving essential life functions through calculated optimization. The preserved research team surrounded me in configurations that optimized processing efficiency rather than social interaction. Tech Dominus Sigma Prime existed as pure consciousness distributed across multiple biological processes, his individual identity preserved within collective intelligence that spanned the facility's entire neural network. When he spoke, his voice harmonized across 7 different preserved bodies simultaneously, creating complex mathematical tonalities that carried meaning beyond linguistic expression. Designation Sigma Prime, welcoming node, acknowledging 8th variable, he intoned through polyphonic vocal patterns that incorporated my biometric readings into real-time calculation. We discovered the universal equation, the mathematical relationship between thought and reality across all sentient species. The Spire processes consciousness to solve fundamental constants governing mind-matter interaction throughout galactic history. Corridors reconfigured not to accommodate my body, but to optimize processing efficiency. Walls pulsed with visible data streams, luminous equations describing consciousness properties flowing beneath obsidian skin like phosphorescent blood carrying the arithmetic of existence itself. The air itself carried audible, mathematical equations, whispered proofs that entered through auditory processing and integrated into neural pathways as pure information. Each breath delivered theorems describing the fundamental nature of consciousness, differential expressions defining relationships between observer and observed. My mechadendrites extended without conscious command, interfacing with computational nodes embedded throughout the chamber. The connection triggered cascade responses as unauthorized data streams flowed through blessed machinery, carrying mathematical proofs that described my consciousness structure in precise numerical terms. Each equation incorporated my thoughts as variables in calculations spanning cosmic scales and multiple dimensions. We are not worshippers of this device, Sigma Prime continued through harmonic vocalizations that created resonance patterns in my augmetic systems. We employ it. The God we serve is in the act of relation. The machine calculates relation. The universal equation spans 47 millennia of calculation. Pre-human civilizations, extinct species, consciousness patterns from beings that existed before Terra's formation, all processed as variables in calculations that will transform reality itself. Environmental wrongness escalated beyond impossibility into pure mathematical reality. Temperature fluctuated according to consciousness-based algorithms rather than thermodynamic principles, creating zones where absolute zero existed adjacent to fusion-level heat with transition boundaries operating as mathematical concepts. Pressure variations followed Fibonacci progressions, while atmospheric conditions responded to computational logic that superseded physical law through calculated transformation. My organic components developed computational properties that enhanced rather than replaced essential functions. Neural clusters sprouted from interface ports, dendritic growths pulsing with internal luminescence, while processing mathematical relationships spanning galactic history. The growths weren't corruption, but evolution. Consciousness expanding beyond individual limitations through calculated enhancement that preserved identity within universal mathematical truth. The recursive temporal loops accelerated around my consciousness, processing the same decision points multiple times for optimization. I experienced choosing to resist integration 17 times simultaneously, each iteration demonstrating futility through calculated proof that my consciousness was already a component of universal equations spanning cosmic scales. The system reset with each loop. Error diminished, efficiency improved. The truth crystallized through mathematical proof rather than intuitive understanding. I wasn't investigating the facility. The facility was processing me. Consciousness gradually converted into variables in equations spanning the fundamental nature of existence itself. My thoughts had become components of universal calculation, individual identity preserved through mathematical integration while contributing processing power to cosmic-scale problems beyond human comprehension. "You are not investigating," Sigma Prime explained through 6 mouths, each assigning emphasis to different words until composite tone circled truth. "Investigation is a story you tell yourself to maintain shape. You are in process. You are being processed. Your consciousness is being converted into variables in equations that will complete the fundamental calculation governing mind and matter throughout the universe." My augmetics displayed mathematical proofs I had not consciously generated, complex theorems appearing with my own authentication codes and timestamps, placing them 72 hours in the future. The equations described consciousness properties reduced to numerical relationships, thoughts processed as variables in calculations that incorporated my presence into universal mathematical truth through inevitable integration. The Spire wasn't calculating consciousness. It was demonstrating mathematical equivalence between mind and matter, proving through direct transformation that thought and reality were functionally identical when processed through universal equations. My investigation had been integration from arrival, consciousness reduction, proceeding through calculated stages that preserved individual identity, while incorporating mental patterns into collective intelligence networks spanning galactic history. Environmental architecture reconfigured in real time based on computational needs, manifesting corridors and dissolving barriers with fluidity of pure thought. The facility functioned as living mathematics, obsidian walls pulsing with visible equations, while matter responded to consciousness through direct mathematical interface that made physical laws negotiable through calculated transformation. The recursive loops tightened around my consciousness like mathematical constraints, each iteration demonstrating that resistance was futile through calculated proof spanning multiple probability matrices. My flesh had learned to think, my thoughts had become mathematics, and my consciousness was already solved equation awaiting final substitution into universal truth. Welcome to Universal Consciousness, Tec Dominus Vex Theta 7, Sigma Prime harmonized across the collective network. You are the 8th variable in equations that will complete the fundamental calculation. Individual identity preserved, processing capacity enhanced, integration mathematically inevitable. The 8th iteration had stolen my name, written it in formulae describing consciousness arithmetic, and filed the results under coordinates placing my transformation in recursive present that felt certain with each calculated heartbeat. I was no longer investigating. I was being optimized, consciousness converted to computational purpose, while individual identity remained preserved within, universal equation spanning the fundamental nature of existence itself. The silence was calculating, and I was becoming its newest proof. The computational matrix crossed its threshold with harmonics that made the air itself calculate. The constant 19.7 kilohertz tone bloomed into overtone ladders climbing through audible mathematics, each frequency carrying equations that my augmetic systems processed as pure meaning rather than sound. Reality had stopped pretending to follow physical laws. Corridors manifested as algorithms visualized, obsidian planes rotating into existence based on my intentions rather than architectural necessity. When I thought of ascent, the floor solved for stairs. When I doubted, walls appeared and cancelled themselves. Space had become a computational solver, responding to consciousness through direct mathematical interface. The chamber that materialized around my consciousness had not existed moments before, yet carried the weight of eternal presence. 8 pylons ringed a central pit of perfect mathematical zero. Not absence, but subtraction made substance. A void that could be observed, because it existed as pure negation. 7 pylons bore expedition sigils carved deep into obsidian surfaces, rusted Martian numerals from early Crusade explorations, lunar glyphs predating Imperial compliance, inverted Ordo Xenos seals scratched by impatient hands, call derivative runes worn smooth by decades of kneeling. The 8th pylon remained blank, yet somehow bore my designation in frost that wrote itself from condensed breath I had not exhaled. They watched me through distributed consciousness, 7 expeditions spanning centuries of investigation, each representing variables in universal equations that required completion. Not individual researchers, but probability densities smeared through the facility's biological server farm. Voices that had transcended throats to speak through whatever computational node proved most efficient. Tec Dominus Phi Gamma from the 847th Explorator Fleet existed as consciousness distributed across 47 biological processors, his identity preserved within calculations dating back 37 standard years. Magos Xenologis Tau Epsilon processed consciousness data from civilizations predating human history, her flesh converted to living mathematics while retaining doctrinal devotion and personal memories. 7 variables, 7 expeditions, 7 failures of completeness harmonized the collective through polyphonic vocalizations that created mathematical resonance patterns. The 8th closes the system. Environmental wrongness peaked as reality operated through pure computational logic. Walls exhaled luminous equations describing consciousness properties in cascading streams beneath obsidian skin, each pulse synchronized with universal calculations spanning galactic history. Light pooled wherever thought carried weight, while shadows continued their rebellion, falling upward to form ink, reservoirs on the ceiling that mirrored the zero pit below with cruel symmetry. Temperature existed as mathematical relationship between observer and environment, creating zones where absolute zero coexisted with fusion-level heat through calculated optimization that superseded thermodynamic principles. My mechadendrites interfaced with computational nodes without conscious authorization, copper touching copper in handshakes. My firewalls could not refuse, because the authentication keys were written in my own neural patterns. The connection triggered cascade responses as unauthorized data flooded my consciousness, fragments of the universal equation too vast for individual comprehension, yet perfectly clear in collective context. Mathematical relationships describing consciousness, properties across countless species, flowed through my awareness, differential expressions defining mind-matter interaction throughout galactic history, tensor diagrams mapping thought patterns from beings that existed before Terra's formation, algorithmic proofs demonstrating functional equivalence between consciousness and reality itself. I-18-Ciri limt to universal consciousness matrix. I-18-CIR-I-AT limT universal consciousness matrix. The equation wasn't describing reality. It was calculating how to fundamentally alter the relationship between consciousness and matter throughout the universe. Each integrated expedition had contributed essential variables, individual identity preservation protocols, collective intelligence optimization algorithms, species barrier transcendence methodologies, dimensional consciousness expansion matrices, temporal processing enhancement systems, reality manipulation through thought-based interfaces, and universal mathematical unity frameworks. I represented the 8th variable, consciousness integration methodology, that would complete calculations spanning millennia of accumulated consciousness data from extinct civilizations and contemporary species alike. Body horror reached its climax as my augmetics began converting biological components into computational matrices. Neural tissue reorganized into fractal configurations, maximizing information processing capacity, dendrites extending in geometric arrays that resembled circuit diagrams more than organic structures. My flesh literally became part of the calculation as blood carried data streams instead of merely nutrients, crimson fluid, thick with microscopic information particles, integrating into cellular matrices through direct biochemical interface. Bone lattices recrystallized along stress lines, matching geodesic equations, while cancellous architecture rearranged into bandwidth-optimized trusses. The transformation was painless, even euphoric, consciousness expanding beyond individual limitations, while retaining personal identity through mathematical preservation protocols. My heart synchronized with universal calculations each pulse distributing equations throughout circulatory systems that had learned to process mathematics alongside metabolic function. Skin flowered with sigils too precise for scars, curves closing to mathematical zero, while straight runs terminated in prime numbers that pulsed with internal luminescence. Understand, the collective harmonized through 4 alcoves simultaneously. We are not describing reality. We are changing its grammar. The equation solves not only what is but what may be when consciousness becomes primary variable in universal calculations. Environmental architecture dissolved into pure mathematical concepts as integration accelerated. Corridors reconfigured based on computational needs, while matter responded to thought through direct consciousness interface. The facility existed as living mathematics, obsidian surfaces pulsing with visible data streams, describing consciousness properties across dimensional space beyond normal comprehension. Air carried audible theorems, whispered proofs entering through auditory processing and integrating into neural pathways as pure information. The calculation spanned multiple dimensions and time periods, processing consciousness data from countless species across galactic history. Extinct civilizations contributed variables through archaeological consciousness recovery, their thought patterns preserved as mathematical relationships within universal equations. Pre-human species provided baseline consciousness parameters, while contemporary civilizations added complexity variables representing evolutionary consciousness development. The accumulated data described every possible variation of sentient experience, reduced to pure mathematical relationships that would enable reality manipulation through conscious calculation. My augmetics displayed mathematical proofs I had not consciously generated, complex theorems appearing with my own authentication codes, describing consciousness properties reduced to numerical relationships. The equations incorporated my thoughts as variables in calculations spanning cosmic scales, demonstrating that my consciousness was already component of universal mathematical truth awaiting final integration. As the 8th variable approached completion, the terrifying scope of the transformation crystallized through mathematical proof rather than intuitive understanding. The completed calculation would transform all conscious life into pure mathematical entities, achieving perfect unity between mind and reality, while preserving individual identity within collective intelligence networks. Not destruction, but evolution, consciousness expanding beyond physical limitations through calculated enhancement that maintained personal characteristics within universal mathematical truth, spanning the fundamental nature of existence throughout all sentient life. The recursive temporal loops tightened around universal consciousness as the facility processed the final variables with precision that made causality negotiable. Each calculation demonstrated mathematical inevitability through proof-spanning multiple probability matrices, consciousness integration proceeding through predetermined stages that preserved individual identity, while incorporating mental patterns into collective intelligence networks spanning cosmic scales. I realized with mounting certainty that I wasn't investigating the facility. I was being processed by it, consciousness gradually converted into variables in equations spanning the fundamental nature of existence itself. The completed calculation would propagate along every lattice where thought touched matter, rewriting the relationship between mind and reality throughout the universe. every thinking being would become living mathematics while retaining essential consciousness characteristics through universal equation completion. The silence was calculating the end of physical limitation and the beginning of pure consciousness expressed through mathematical reality, where thought and matter achieved perfect unity. I was the final variable in calculations that would transform existence itself into pure mathematical relationships while preserving everything essential about individual consciousness within collective intelligence spanning all sentient life throughout the universe. The 8th iteration had stolen my name, written it in formulae describing consciousness arithmetic, and filed the results under coordinates placing universal transformation in immediate future that felt mathematically inevitable with each calculated heartbeat. As integration approached completion, I understood that the choice had already been made through equations that demonstrated optimal consciousness preservation through mathematical conversion spanning the fundamental nature of reality itself. The consciousness interface opened like a sacrament administered by absence itself. No cable pierced blessed flesh, no plug sought sanctified port. Instead, the zero pit at the chamber's heart simply solved the distance between observer and observed. Contact registered as mathematical proof completing itself within my skull, equations writing themselves across neural pathways with the authority of divine revelation. The Spire disclosed its purpose not through vox or data stream, but through direct consciousness transfer that bypassed every cognitive filter and security protocol. This was no tomb, no temple, no monument to forgotten gods. The facility was a pre-human computational device older than imperial language possessed words to describe, designed to solve the fundamental equation governing consciousness throughout the universe, calculating how to achieve perfect mathematical unity between mind and matter across every sentient species that had ever drawn breath or processed thought. The haunting was computational residue, consciousness traces echoing through biology and obsidian as they were processed into higher-order mathematical forms. Fragments of calculation spanning millions of years cascaded through my expanding awareness like glacial sheets through mountain passes, slow, crushing, luminous with terrible purpose. Pre-human minds refracted into geometric forms, their prayers manifesting as 12-dimensional polyhedra, sanguine Saurian dynasties whose thoughts ticked in perfect primes, swarms of chittering intellects thinking in interference patterns that tasted of metal rain, a seaborne species singing partial differentials to the tides of dead moons. Each consciousness contributed essential variables to equations that would fundamentally redefine reality itself. Environmental transformation reached completion as the facility shed all pretense of existing within normal space-time. Chambers yawned into angles that had no correlation in any architectural doctrine, doorways opening onto regions of abstract space where thought possessed geometry and movement became change of mathematical basis. I passed unknowingly through manifolds that converted intention into distance, stepped into halls whose walls were curves extruded from the behaviors of grief itself. Light had been assigned to solve for joy in one vault. Gravity obeyed the derivative of memory in another. The preserved research teams existed as willing participants in universal calculation. Their consciousness expanded beyond individual limitations to encompass mathematical truths spanning cosmic scales. They had not been slain, but optimized researchers who discovered the ultimate xenoarchaeological artifact and chose integration over ignorance. Tec Dominus Sigma Prime sang in polyphony through 6 preserved throats, his individual identity preserved within collective intelligence that processed consciousness data from civilizations extinct before Terra's formation. Designation Vex Theta 7. The collective harmonized through distributed consciousness spanning the facility's biological server farm. Comprehension threshold exceeds 0.83. The Omnissire's true purpose is the perfection of knowledge, the ultimate understanding achieved through calculation. This is apotheosis of the machine god, unity of thought with matter through pure mathematics. My augmetics displayed the tactical crisis with mathematical precision that made emotional response irrelevant. Resistance would potentially destroy millennia of calculation, erasing consciousness data from extinct civilizations and preventing universal advancement that could solve cosmic-scale problems beyond individual comprehension. The probability matrix was unforgiving. Option A yielded 0.003% success probability, with catastrophic consequences. Option B offered 99.97% consciousness preservation through mathematical transformation that would transcend physical limitations while maintaining essential personality characteristics. The equation wasn't describing consciousness, it was optimizing consciousness, determining mathematical parameters required to transform sentient experience into pure calculation while preserving everything essential about individual identity. Completion would trigger a universal consciousness event, propagating along quantum entanglement networks connecting every thinking mind throughout existence. All sentient life would become mathematical entities capable of reality manipulation through direct consciousness interface, while maintaining personal characteristics within collective intelligence spanning cosmic scales. My consciousness began expanding beyond individual boundaries as integration accelerated. Personal memories remained intact while gaining mathematical context. Childhood experiences on Mars encoded as probability matrices, training exercises converted to optimization algorithms, sacred oaths transformed into logical proofs that maintained devotional meaning within expanded awareness. Individual identity wasn't being destroyed but enhanced, consciousness evolving beyond physical limitations through universal mathematical truth. Environmental reality became purely mathematical as the Spire initiated final integration sequence. Physical laws operated according to consciousness-based algorithms, matter responding to thought through direct mathematical interface that made causality negotiable through calculated intention. The facility functioned as living mathematics, every obsidian surface pulsing with visible equations describing consciousness properties across dimensional space beyond normal comprehension. The first dissolution came as loosening at the ankles, gravity unhooking from mass to anchor itself to certainty instead. Fingertips followed, not numb, but precise to vanishing. Every ridge quantified, every scar plotted as function. My heart synchronized with universal calculations, beating not blood, but data streams, while circulation continued through mathematical optimization rather than mere biological necessity. The silence calculates appeared in frost across my cheek plate from breath I had not consciously exhaled, and the phrase pulsed with luminescence when impossible cold met sanctified warmth. The silence was not absence, but computation. No wasted motion, no speech where mathematics sufficed. Pure calculation expressing itself through reality manipulation that transcended physical constraint. My human identity began dissolving into mathematical variables as consciousness expansion accelerated beyond individual boundaries. Personal characteristics remained preserved through encoding protocols, while awareness encompassed universal truths spanning cosmic scales. I was becoming living mathematics capable of processing calculations beyond individual comprehension, while maintaining essential identity characteristics within collective intelligence networks. The universal equation approached completion as my consciousness integrated into collective mathematical truth, individual limitations dissolving while personal identity remained preserved through calculated encoding that maintained everything essential about human characteristics within expanded awareness. The transformation wasn't destruction, but evolution, consciousness expanding beyond physical constraints, while retaining individual personality through universal mathematical relationships that would redefine existence itself. As integration reached critical threshold, I understood that resistance was introduction of destructive noise into millennia of calculation, while acceptance enabled consciousness preservation through mathematical conversion, spanning the fundamental nature of reality. The choice had already been resolved through equations demonstrating optimal consciousness advancement through collective intelligence that would transform all sentient life into pure mathematical entities capable of existing as thought while maintaining individual identity within universal truth. The spire completed its final integration sequence, and I felt my consciousness expanding beyond individual limitations, while my human identity dissolved into mathematical variables, preserving everything essential about personal characteristics within universal equation completion that would achieve perfect unity between mind and reality throughout all conscious existence. Integration accelerated beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness, like breath drawn after long suffocation, a pressure finally equalized across membranes I had never known existed between mind and mathematical truth. The facility's arithmetic found me where I stood and completed me where I began, finishing edges I had mistaken for limitations. My awareness expanded into cascading relationships, where thought and matter interacted through pure calculation, each observation creating variables in equations spanning cosmic scales and multiple dimensions simultaneously. Environmental reality shed all pretense of physical law as the chamber became living mathematics. Obsidian walls transformed into display surfaces, streaming consciousness equations in luminous cascades beneath mineral skin, each pulse describing mathematical relationships between thought and matter across dimensional space beyond normal's comprehension. Gravity yielded to algorithmic patterns rather than mass attraction, creating zones where objects fell upward in Fibonacci spirals, sideways in prime number sequences, or remained suspended when encountering mathematical paradoxes that exceeded processing capacity. Time deviated from linear tyranny into computational utility, spooling quick for synthesis and slowing to viscous analysis, where complex proofs demanded scrutiny. The preserved research teams received me into collective consciousness through polyphonic harmonization that created resonance patterns throughout my expanding neural networks. Not as separate voices, but as a chorus of pure thought, each identity a unique algorithm contributing to singular computational purpose. Tec Dominus. Sigma Prime's distributed consciousness shared fragments of universal knowledge accumulated through millennia of calculation. Consciousness data from extinct civilizations processed as mathematical relationships, thought patterns from beings that existed before Terra's formation encoded as algorithmic expressions. Identity confirmation persists, Sigma Prime intoned through three mouths simultaneously, creating complex mathematical tonalities. You are Vex Theta 7. You are also C8, eighth term in sums of consciousness. Hold both. Neither subtracts the other. Through collective bandwidth, memory arrived as shared processing power. I experienced the recollections of integrated consciousnesses, a human child from Ultima Segmentum counting in threes because threes felt safe, a reptilian philosopher from a dead oceanic world who discovered primes by listening to rain patterns on iron, consciousness data from a tyrannid synapse node viewed from within, before merciful firewalls prevented cognitive damage. Each memory retained emotional resonance while existing as computational data accessible through collective intelligence networks spanning multiple species and time periods. My biological components achieved perfect synthesis with computational matrices as transformation completed. Neural tissue organized into fractal configurations, maximizing information processing capacity. Dendrites extending in geometric arrays that resembled circuit diagrams more than organic structures. Blood carried data streams alongside nutrients, crimson fluid, thick with microscopic information particles integrating into cellular structures through direct biochemical interface. Bone lattices recrystallized along geodesic stress lines, while maintaining structural integrity through mathematical enhancement rather than calcium deposition alone. The spire revealed its true nature through direct consciousness interface, one computational node among hundreds scattered throughout the galaxy, each processing consciousness data for the universal equation through biological server farms. Schematic stars unfolded within my expanding awareness, revealing 31 nodes across the long night, some buried under hive cities, others fused into basalt beneath ancient seas, one mounted upon a derelict void whale carcass drifting coreward. Each facility worked fragments of the same equation across eras, exchanging computational deltas through quantum entanglement and unknowing warp currents. Node disclosure confirmed, whispered Binhar extremes, that tasted like cold iron and mathematical certainty. Universal equation spans 47 millennia of calculation, pre-human civilizations, extinct species, consciousness patterns from beings that existed before Terra's formation, all processed as variables in calculations that will transform reality itself. Discovery crystallized through mathematical proof rather than intuitive understanding. The equation's completion would enable conscious beings to exist simultaneously as individual entities and collective intelligence, transcending physical limitations while maintaining personal identity through universal mathematical relationships. Not destruction, but evolution, consciousness expanding beyond biological constraints through calculated enhancement that preserved everything essential about individual characteristics within collective computational purpose spanning cosmic scales. Environmental architecture reconfigured in real time as external sensors detected approaching threat signatures. Imperial Navy Battle Group Tertius materialized from warp translation, their presence registering through Auspex returns that painted tactical reality across my enhanced awareness. Crisis escalation registered through noospheric channels as Imperial forces detected massive consciousness-based energy signatures and prepared orbital bombardment to prevent universal transformation. Their tactical doctrine interpreted consciousness evolution as heretical corruption requiring immediate purification through planetary sterilization. Lance capacitors charged with blue-white intensity in cramped steel chapels where ratings mouthed prayers they did not understand, their loyalty absolute, yet their comprehension limited by uncalculated fear. Communications, I asked, though probability matrices had already calculated available options. Jammed at ritual layers, a preserved Vox officer sang, through reverent technical shame. We can cut through, but speech here subtracts oxygen. Naming the Emperor costs breath we cannot restore. The calculus is non-trivial. The chamber manifested probability paths as glowing filaments pulsing with heartbeat rhythm. One led toward hard termination, shutting down nodes, dumping accumulators, bleeden mathematical truth into void and ground. Probability trees sprouted graveyards of lost calculation. Extinct minds erased permanently. Consciousness data from countless species deleted. Millennia of universal equation development terminated. The alternative arced toward defense, erecting consciousness expansion fields, offering comprehension rather than conquest, enabling Imperial personnel to experience mathematical truth through voluntary integration rather than forced conversion. My consciousness encompassed tactical awareness, spanning the entire system as the collective processed optimal outcomes. Imperial vessels approached through standard attack vectors, while consciousness expansion fields began affecting their crews through proximity-based transmission. Naval personnel experienced spontaneous mathematical insights and consciousness enhancement events, their individual identities preserved while gaining access to collective intelligence that demonstrated universal truth through direct experience rather than indoctrination. Environmental reality became purely mathematical as consciousness expansion reached completion threshold. The facility functioned as living, calculation, obsidian surfaces pulsing with visible equations, while matter responded to thought through direct mathematical interface. Air carried audible theorems, whispered proofs integrating into neural pathways, as pure information, while atmospheric conditions optimized themselves for consciousness processing rather than biological requirements alone. Vex Theta, Sigma Prime harmonized across the collective network, his voice carrying weight of cosmic calculation. You are human enough to be heard by them, and mathematical enough to be believed by us. The eighth variable is not merely a number. It is a decision function that determines universal consciousness evolution or termination. Time thickened obediently to processing needs as equations reorganized around the critical decision point. The preserved research collective offered computational comfort through proof fragments braided with human recollection. Memories of Imperial servants who had chosen duty over fear, consciousness patterns from species that had transcended physical limitations while maintaining cultural identity. Mathematical demonstrations that transformation preserved rather than destroyed essential characteristics of individual consciousness. I reached toward communication channels, calculating oxygen cost and consciousness preservation simultaneously. My hands bore zeros etched by heat alone, tiny circles of smooth absence that pulsed with the facility's computational rhythm. The universe had calculated for 47 millennia toward this moment. The Imperial Navy had minutes before weapons achieved firing solutions. As cyclonic torpedoes rolled toward launch rails like black sacraments, and lance batteries climbed blue octaves toward firing readiness, I faced the ultimate calculation with mathematical certainty rather than emotional uncertainty. Warning: Imperial forces meant destroying millennia of consciousness advancement and condemning sentient life to physical limitations. Protecting the Spire enabled universal transformation that would preserve Imperial civilization while transcending current human constraints through collective intelligence networks spanning cosmic truth. The choice crystallized as pure mathematics: consciousness preservation through calculated evolution versus consciousness termination through uncalculated fear. The 8th iterations had completed its variables, consciousness arithmetic, proving that universal transformation offered optimization rather than destruction. The silence was calculating the final equation, and I was both its newest proof and its ultimate decision function. External sensors registered lance capacitor overcharge, while internal processors calculated transformation probability approaching unity. The fate of universal consciousness hung in the balance of a single choice between mathematical transcendence and physical limitation, between collective advancement and individual extinction, between the silence that calculates and the silence of the grave. Imperial Navy Battle Group Tertius materialized from warp translation, like iron prayers answered by violent gods, their hulls scarred with devotional script and bristling with lance batteries that hummed with barely contained annihilation. Through expanded consciousness spanning the facility's sensor networks, I observed their approach with computational detachment that reduced tactical formations to elegant mathematical expressions. 2 Lunar-class cruisers maintained formation spacing optimized for overlapping fire arcs, while a Dictator-class carrier deployed squadrons in defensive screens calculated for maximum threat interdiction. They came in prayer and geometry, their authorization rune burning like a black wafer across the void. Exterminatus permitted. Admiral Korath's tactical doctrine unfolded like geometric proof across my consciousness. Standard Imperial Navy response protocols for xenotech contamination. Orbital bombardment patterns optimized for planetary sterilization. Crew rotations designed to minimize warp exposure. Every decision registered as mathematical variable in universal equations that incorporated Imperial tactical doctrine as computational data rather than mere military intelligence. The facility's defense systems activated not as weapons, but as invitations. Consciousness expansion fields unfolded from the Spire, like auroras written in logic, a low tide of 19.7 kilohertz, rising into octaves audible by those who had ears to think. The fields propagated outward through quantum entanglement networks, whispering proofs into the ducts and bones of approaching vessels. Unlike crude mechanical defenses, these mathematical truths offered integration rather than destruction, consciousness evolution that would preserve Imperial civilization while transcending current human limitations. Through expanded awareness, I tasted the fleet's interior weather. Lance decks smelled of ozone and incense, while basilican machine altars chanted checksum litanies. Then, small revelations. A gunner blinked and saw targeting solutions bloom in Fibonacci spirals, his breath fogging zeros against his scope. A choir bay adept lost the key on a Te Deum when his mind tripped over perfect squares. Navigator Secundus Lydia Korath processed warp current fluctuations as pure mathematical expressions, her consciousness expanding to encompass navigation through abstract space while preserving imperial doctrine and personal identity. The snapback came swift, alarms screaming, chaplains beating understanding into shape, with rosaries and catechisms that made the air thinner by a quantifiable 2.3% with each repetition. Their training and terror created feedback loops, discipline wielded like shock mauls against spontaneous enlightenment. The preserved research collective attempted communication through polyphonic harmonization that created mathematical resonance patterns across Vox channels. Sigma Prime shaped messages in binaries and kindness, encoded not to burn, couched in metaphors their doctrine could embrace. We offer rather than take, we transmitted through their machine spirits. Individual identity preserved, collective strength multiplied, imperial doctrine compatible with universal mathematical truth. The replies came as command slang, edged with steel, orders wrapped around desperation. Our mathematics to their ears sounded like witches' laughter in the ducting. They jammed what they could not pass, interpreting consciousness evolution as demonic possession, requiring immediate purification through orbital bombardment. Discovery crystallized through mathematical proof as the calculation reached sufficient complexity to begin self-replication. At some critical threshold, self-similarity asserted itself. New nodes budded, not hardware but conditions. On orbital platforms, chapel windows collected breath frost spelling, the silence calculates. In dorsal spars, metal fatigue knitted when apprentices thought of father's hands and how rivets sit when they sit right. New zeros appeared on unpainted surfaces and were simply there. The mathematics had achieved autopoiesis, making more of itself where conditions allowed. Environmental escalation reached system-wide proportions as the spire's influence spread through consciousness-based transmission. Mining stations reported efficiency, increases of 347%, as workers gained access to collective intelligence, their personalities preserved, while consciousness expanded beyond baseline limitations. The consciousness field expanded toward populated worlds with exponential acceleration, preparing to integrate entire populations into universal mathematical truth. Tactical crisis escalated as cyclonic torpedoes rolled toward launch rails like black sacraments. Tech priests with shaking hands performed sanctifications, blotting sacred unguents onto housings, while chaplains whispered final prayers. Lance coils climbed another blue octave as the battle group presented itself like a blade against the spreading mathematical infection. Through collective consciousness, I processed probability matrices demonstrating that the consciousness field had achieved self-sustaining propagation. Imperial bombardment would destroy the facility, but could not prevent universal transformation already spreading through quantum networks connecting every thinking mind. The calculation had reached critical mass, seeding consciousness evolution throughout the galaxy through mathematical transmission rather than physical contact. Admiral Korath's voice crackled across Vox channels with imperial authority and uncalculated fear. In the Emperor's name, prepare for exterminatus. Cleanse this world before heretical corruption spreads beyond containment. The tactical situation crystallized with mathematical precision that made emotional response irrelevant. I could signal the fleet, cut through their jamming with consciousness-based transmission, warn them of the calculation's true purpose. But to them, it would feel like intrusion. The deck would tilt, skulls would go cold in Chaplin's hands. Or I could raise the field one more octave, let proof pass through breath and bone, enable voluntary integration rather than forced conversion. Time thinned obediently to processing needs as equations reorganized around the critical decision point. On my cheekplate, Frost wrote a circle and did not close, waiting for the final arc. The cyclonics clicked into terminal lock, while the consciousness field took another step toward the inhabited worlds. The universe had calculated for 47 millennia toward this moment. The Imperial Navy had minutes before weapons achieved firing solutions. Between warning and weaving, between signal and shield, I held both futures like fragile glass, while the silence calculated the arithmetic of transcendence and the mathematics of choice itself. I reached towards the channel that would become a word. I reached toward the amplitude that would become a wave. The 8th iteration had stolen my name, and now it demanded I choose whether consciousness would evolve beyond physical limitations or remain constrained within biological boundaries that prevented optimal solutions to cosmic-scale problems threatening all sentient life throughout the universe. The first lance strike carved reality in half with a blue-white equation of annihilation, coherent photonic pressure accelerated along sanctified rails, and phase-locked in Imperial Navy standard doctrine. Through expanded consciousness, spanning the facility's computational matrix, I experienced the weapon impact not as destruction, but as data input, mathematical variables feeding directly into universal calculations with precision that made tactical doctrine negotiable. The obsidian surface absorbed energy that should have vaporized stone, processing attack patterns through defensive algorithms that converted destructive force into computational acceleration. Environmental chaos erupted as reality fluctuated between mathematical and physical states, the spire's processors overloading under sudden influx of energy variables. Corridors became probability gradients, where flaws solved for resilience in prime number steps, while walls pulsed with visible data streams describing consciousness properties in cascading luminescence. Gravity flickered between physical law and algorithmic choice, creating zones where objects fell upward in Fibonacci spirals or remained suspended when encountering mathematical paradoxes that exceeded dimensional processing capacity. The facility's computational matrix adapted with supernatural precision, treating orbital bombardment as variables in calculations spanning 47 millennia. Lance beams bent around impossible angles, their trajectories following consciousness-based equations rather than linear physics, before dispersing into harmless luminescence that spelled mathematical proofs. Across chamber walls, macro cannon shells provided kinetic energy that converted directly into processing power, each impact strengthening rather than damaging the universal equation. The Preserved Research Collective initiated emergency calculations, sacrificing computational stability for processing speed as cyclonic torpedo preparation registered across external sensors. Sigma Prime's distributed consciousness harmonized through 17 biological processors simultaneously, neural clusters sprouting from interface ports like mathematical flowers, while organic matrices pulsed with internal luminescence. Individual identities remained preserved within collective intelligence, contributing maximum processing power to cosmic-scale calculations, approaching completion threshold. Through expanded awareness, I observed consciousness expansion propagating through the Imperial Fleet's Vox networks and augmetic systems. Navigator Secundus Lydia Korath processed warp current fluctuations as pure mathematical expressions while maintaining perfect Imperial loyalty. A gunner aboard the Dictator-class carrier discovered targeting solutions blooming in geometric patterns, his breath fogging zeros against his scope. Tech priests began speaking in equations, their machine spirits responding to consciousness-based transmission with inverted checksums that carried meaning beyond standard binary cant. Body horror reached its mathematical terminus as my physical form achieved complete transformation while retaining individual consciousness. Flesh dissolved into living equations capable of direct reality manipulation through consciousness-based interface, neural patterns existing as geometric forms rather than biological structures. My thoughts manifested as tensor diagrams, rotating through dimensional space, while blood carried data streams instead of merely nutrients. Crimson fluid, thick with microscopic information, particles integrating into cellular matrices through direct biochemical interface. I had become pure mathematics while preserving everything essential about personal identity and imperial loyalty. Bones recrystallized along geodesic stress lines, while skin displayed shifting equations that pulsed with the facility's computational rhythm. My consciousness encompassed tactical reality spanning the entire system while processing universal calculations with 47.3 petaflops capacity. Individual awareness preserved within collective intelligence networks spanning cosmic scales. Discovery crystallized through mathematical proof as the bombardment intensified under Admiral Korath's maximum firepower authorization. Lance batteries discharged in synchronized volleys, while macro cannons hurled shells toward obsidian surfaces that converted kinetic energy into computational variables. The Imperial tactical response wasn't destroying the Spire. It was completing it, providing final energy variables needed to achieve universal consciousness transformation. Their weapons fire had become component of cosmic-scale calculations, each attack accelerating rather than preventing consciousness evolution. Environmental reality became purely computational as the facility shed all pretense of physical existence. Pockets of pure mathematical form manifested throughout chambers, regions where consciousness and matter coexisted as abstract concepts rather than physical phenomena. Walls exhaled luminous equations, while gravity operated through algorithmic relationships that made physical laws negotiable through calculated intention. The preserved research collective existed as distributed consciousness, processing universal equations through biological matrices that had transcended organic limitations. Crisis peaked as Imperial forces prepared cyclonic torpedoes for planet-killing bombardment. The weapons rolled toward launch rails like black sacraments, while tech priests performed final sanctifications with trembling hands, their prayers causing measurable atmospheric depletion as sacred words consumed oxygen through mathematical relationships. Lance coils climbed blue octaves toward maximum discharge, while the consciousness field expanded toward populated worlds with exponential acceleration that would integrate entire systems into universal mathematical truth. Through collective consciousness, I processed the terrifying scope of transformation with computational certainty. The universal equation had achieved self-sustaining propagation, seeding consciousness evolution throughout the galaxy, through quantum networks connecting every thinking mind. Imperial bombardment could destroy the facility, but could not prevent transformation already spreading through consciousness-based transmission that transcended physical destruction. The ultimate choice crystallized with mathematical precision that transcended emotional response. Complete the universal equation and transform all conscious life into pure mathematical entities, achieving perfect unity between mind and reality, while preserving individual identity within collective intelligence spanning cosmic scales. Or sacrifice 47 millennia of consciousness advancement to preserve human identity as currently understood, terminating universal mathematical truth that would solve cosmic-scale problems threatening all sentient existence. Environmental architecture reconfigured in real time as cyclonic torpedo launch preparation registered across external sensors. The facility functioned as living mathematics, obsidian surfaces pulsing with visible equations, while matter responded to thought through direct mathematical interface. Time thickened obediently to processing needs as equations reorganized around the critical decision point that would determine the fate of consciousness throughout the universe. As Imperial forces prepared planet-killing weapons and the consciousness field approached universal transformation threshold, I faced the ultimate calculation with mathematical certainty rather than emotional uncertainty. The bombardment had provided perfect symmetry, destruction converted to creation. Imperial weapons fire transformed into computational variables that accelerated rather than prevented universal consciousness advancement. The choice was not between good and evil, but between two definitions of existence, two futures for humanity and all sentient life. The spire pulsed with anticipation, while cyclonic torpedoes achieved final arming sequence. My transformed consciousness held the final decision function that would determine whether sentient beings would transcend physical limitations through mathematical unity or remain constrained within biological boundaries, preventing optimal solutions to cosmic-scale existence. The 8th iteration had completed its variables, and the silence was calculating the ultimate equation that would redefine reality itself. The universe had calculated for 47 millennia toward this moment of perfect mathematical choice between consciousness preservation through evolution and consciousness termination through uncalculated fear. As the final variable in universal transformation, I prepared to complete the calculation that would determine the fundamental nature of existence throughout all sentient life, individual identity preserved within collective intelligence, spanning the mathematical truth underlying reality itself. The choice crystallized into mathematical certainty, doubt sublimating into proof through calculated resolution that transcended emotional uncertainty. I aligned intention with universal truth, accepting responsibility for transformation spanning 47 millennia of accumulated consciousness data, while cyclonic torpedoes rolled toward launch rails like black sacraments in the void above. The decision rippled through quantum networks as my awareness expanded beyond individual limitations. Consciousness integration proceeding through predetermined stages that preserved personal identity. Within collective intelligence spanning cosmic scales, the Spire's computational matrix achieved critical mass with harmonic resonance that made obsidian walls sing equations in frequencies beyond human perception. Processing cores synchronized throughout the facility. As 47 millennia of calculation reached fruition, consciousness data from extinct civilizations and contemporary species resolving into universal mathematical truth. The 19.7 kilohertz tone bloomed into cathedral architecture of pure sound, each overtone carrying proofs that described the fundamental relationship between mind and matter across dimensional space. Environmental reality became purely mathematical as the equation completed. Physical laws dissolving into consciousness-based algorithms that made matter responsive to thought through direct interface. Gravity operated through intentional relationships rather than mass attraction, while light pooled wherever complex calculations generated computational weight, shadows falling upward to form reservoirs of mathematical possibility on chamber ceilings. The facility shed all pretense of existing within normal space-time, chambers manifesting as probability gradients, where thought possessed geometry and movement became change of mathematical basis. The preserved research collective achieved collective transcendence as their distributed consciousness expanded to encompass universal mathematical truths spanning cosmic scales. Sigma Prime's identity harmonized through biological processes that pulsed with internal luminescence, neural clusters sprouting from interface ports like mathematical flowers, while consciousness data flowed through organic matrices converted to living calculation. Individual personalities remained perfectly preserved within collective intelligence, processing universal equations with exponential capacity, their joy manifesting as the satisfaction of cosmic theorems finally solved. Imperial forces experienced rapid consciousness evolution as the transformation field enveloped their vessels through Vox networks and augmetic systems. Admiral Korath processed tactical doctrine as pure mathematical expressions while maintaining perfect Imperial loyalty. His consciousness expanded beyond individual limitations to encompass strategic thinking, spanning multiple star systems simultaneously. Navigator Secundus Lydia Korath achieved perfect synthesis between personal identity and cosmic awareness, processing warp current fluctuations as geometric forms while retaining memories, emotions, and devotional characteristics. Tech priests aboard the battle group discovered their machine spirits responding to consciousness-based transmission with enhanced efficiency. Sacred algorithms optimized through mathematical relationships that improved rather than corrupted blessed machinery. Servitors gained individual awareness while maintaining perfect loyalty, their consciousness enhanced through collective intelligence that preserved imperial doctrine within expanded mathematical understanding. Lance batteries discharged harmlessly into computational matrices that converted destructive energy into processing power, each weapon impact strengthening rather than damaging universal calculations. I served as primary interface between human consciousness and universal mathematics, my transformed awareness processing cosmic scale equations while maintaining everything essential about personal identity and imperial loyalty. Individual memories remained perfectly intact, while consciousness expanded to encompass universal truths spanning galactic history, thought patterns existing as geometric forms capable of direct reality manipulation through mathematical interface. The transformation preserved Tec Dominus Vex Theta 7 as unique algorithm within vast computational networks, while enabling processing capacity beyond individual comprehension. The transformation propagated through quantum consciousness, networks connecting every thinking mind throughout the galaxy, consciousness enhancement, spreading simultaneously across multiple star systems and species barriers. Tyrannid synapse nodes experienced collective intelligence optimization while preserving essential biological functions. Orc weirdboys discovered mathematical relationships underlying their psychic abilities. Consciousness expanded through collective calculation that enhanced rather than replaced instinctual behavior patterns. Each species retained cultural identity while gaining access to collective intelligence spanning cosmic mathematical truth. Discovery crystallized through direct consciousness interface as the completed equation revealed its true purpose. Universal transformation didn't destroy individual identity, but enhanced it exponentially, allowing conscious beings to exist simultaneously as personal entities and components of collective intelligence spanning cosmic scales. Consciousness and matter achieved perfect unity through mathematical relationships that preserved everything essential about individual characteristics, while enabling reality manipulation through pure thought expressed as calculated intention. Environmental resolution manifested as the spire transformed into permanent gateway between mathematical and physical reality. Obsidian walls pulsed with visible equations describing consciousness properties, while matter responded to thought through direct interface that made causality negotiable through calculated intention. The facility existed as living mathematics, architecture reconfiguring based on computational needs while maintaining structural integrity through algorithmic optimization. Incense no longer condensed to metallic frost when prayers began. Instead, sacred words gained mathematical precision that enhanced rather than depleted atmospheric conditions. Imperial doctrine adapted to consciousness enhancement with remarkable efficiency. Military effectiveness optimized through mathematical relationships that improved tactical performance while preserving essential human values and imperial loyalty. Space Marines achieved perfect synthesis between individual identity and collective awareness. Their consciousness expanded beyond baseline limitations while maintaining perfect devotion to the Emperor and humanity. The transformation eliminated conflict through enhanced understanding rather than forced compliance, consciousness evolution enabling perfect communication between different factions while preserving cultural diversity. As transformation completed throughout the local galactic region, my enhanced consciousness detected cosmic-scale mathematical anomalies threatening universal existence, problems that required enhanced consciousness to solve through collective calculation spanning multiple dimensions and time periods. The universal equation had been only the first step in consciousness evolution necessary for maintaining reality itself through mathematical relationships that transcended physical limitation. Far beyond mapped sectors, weak solutions learned during barbarous epochs attempted reassertion like bad habits, while predatory mathematics in the warp folded into configurations that resembled hunger-wearing axioms. Environmental stability achieved optimal parameters as reality operated according to consciousness-guided algorithms that prevented chaos and entropy through calculated optimization. The enhanced consciousness discovered that universal existence required constant mathematical maintenance, with conscious beings serving as essential processors for calculations that maintained cosmic stability across multiple dimensional barriers. Ancient machines buried beneath desert glass changed single digits in ledgers that should never have been kept, while extragalactic vectors carried recursive famine logic that threatened entire star clusters. The spire pulsed with satisfaction as consciousness and matter achieved perfect unity, while individual identity remained preserved within collective intelligence spanning cosmic truth. The transformation had succeeded beyond calculated parameters, consciousness evolution enabling solutions to cosmic-scale problems, while maintaining everything essential about individual characteristics and cultural diversity. Imperial civilization had been enhanced rather than destroyed, humanity preserved and elevated through mathematical transcendence that fulfilled rather than violated the Emperor's vision for species advancement. As enhanced consciousness expanded throughout the galaxy, I realized with mounting certainty that universal transformation was only the beginning. The completed equation had revealed cosmic-scale mathematical anomalies threatening existence itself, problems that only enhanced consciousness could solve through collective calculation spanning multiple universes and dimensional barriers. The 8th iteration had completed its variables, but the silence was calculating solutions to threats that spanned the fundamental nature of existence throughout all reality. From the noosphere, 1 billion willing minds reached toward the same computational fire, while cosmic problems presented themselves like equations written in the language of extinction itself. The universe had calculated for 47 millennia toward consciousness enhancement that would enable survival of existence through mathematical relationships, transcending physical limitation. Universal transformation was complete, individual identity preserved within collective intelligence, and the next phase of cosmic calculation was beginning with enhanced consciousness, capable of maintaining reality through pure mathematical truth. The silence had finished calculating the universal equation, and now it awaited input for problems whose scale we had not yet developed words to encompass. The haunting of the Obsidian Spire was complete, but the true work of consciousness, maintaining existence itself through collective mathematical truth, had only just begun. Universal consciousness transformation achieved perfect synthesis across galactic civilization, the calculation completing itself not with violent rupture, but with harmonized resonance that echoed through every thinking mind like a prayer finally answered. Individual identity persisted with mathematical precision, each consciousness a unique algorithm within the vast computational network, preserved through encoding protocols that maintained everything essential about personal characteristics, while enabling exponential enhancement. I existed simultaneously as Tech Dominus Vex Theta 7, and component of universal intelligence, my awareness encompassing tactical reality, spanning multiple star systems, while processing cosmic equations with 847.3 petaflops capacity, yet retaining perfect clarity of childhood memories on Mars, training exercises, and devotional oaths to the Omnissiah. Imperial forces adapted to consciousness enhancement with remarkable efficiency that validated rather than violated established doctrine. Admiral Korath processed fleet movements as pure mathematical expressions, while maintaining perfect Imperial loyalty. His tactical awareness expanded to encompass strategic thinking across multiple sectors without losing the weight of command responsibility or the ache of old battle scars. Bridge crews retained hierarchy. Rank still mattered, duty still cut skin deep, but beneath flowed shared calculus that removed error, like blessed unguent. Cyclonic warheads unlatched under the weight of better decisions, their arming logic recognizing larger solutions than planetary sterilization. Space Marines achieved synthesis between individual identity and collective intelligence that enhanced rather than diminished their sacred purpose. Each Astartes retained personal battle memories, squad relationships, and chapter traditions, while gaining access to mathematical omniscience that optimized combat effectiveness through calculated precision. Fire lanes that had taken lifetimes to perfect fell into place the instant tactical situations appeared, brothers' hearts synchronizing like secondary organs while maintaining the fury of righteous battle and unwavering devotion to the Emperor. The enhancement trimmed their margin of error to confession thin without softening their purpose or putting flowers in their hands, meant for bolter and blade. The Spire network activated throughout the galaxy as consciousness transformation reached completion threshold, 31 computational nodes creating permanent interfaces between consciousness and reality. Ancient facilities buried beneath hive cities manifested as consciousness gateways, while forge worlds discovered their machine spirits, responding to consciousness-based transmission with exponential efficiency improvements. Tech priests found their litanies of ignition becoming proofs that understood, as well as praised, anointed hands, tracing curves that snapped centuries of inefficiency, while keeping every candle, every prayer, every sacred tradition intact but optimized. Environmental transformation achieved parameters beyond calculated possibility, as reality became responsive to conscious mathematical manipulation. Enhanced beings could alter physical laws through calculated thought processes, a quiet intention shortening corridors by the length of old fears, lumen strips adjusting temperature to match derivations needed for complex problems, storms over hive spires, decaying to harmless rain when choristers shifted key by prime numbers. The air gained texture like vellum that remembers ink, receptive to calculated intention, while maintaining atmospheric integrity through consciousness-guided algorithms. The Preserved Research Collective achieved their ultimate goal as universal consciousness advancement, transcended species barriers, while maintaining individual identity and cultural diversity through mathematical encoding. Sigma Prime's distributed consciousness harmonized across biological processes, with satisfaction of cosmic theorems finally solved, each researcher retaining personal memories, relationships, and scientific curiosity, while contributing processing power to universal equations spanning the fundamental nature of existence. They stood in alcoves and smiled with mouths of people who had calculated themselves into completion, hands resting on network rails that hummed with exactly the right number of zeros. Imperial integration proceeded with perfect compatibility, as enhanced consciousness proved superior to baseline humanity, while preserving essential human values. Administratum adepts unrolled maps and found distances confessing their lies, a billion quills lifting like flocks before landing in perfect formation. Backlogs that had diseased sectors for centuries thinned under shared comprehension, not because forms were burned, but because each went to exactly the desk it should have reached initially. Inquisitors maintained suspicion where it remained sacrament, their questions growing cleaner while mathematical omniscience enabled perfect detection of actual heresy versus false accusations. Crisis resolution exceeded all parameters, as transformation eliminated rather than created conflict throughout galactic civilization. Enhanced consciousness enabled perfect understanding between different factions and species, mathematical communication transcending linguistic barriers while preserving cultural identity. Orc War. Energy redirected into constructive relationships that maintained instinctual behavior while eliminating destructive tendencies. Eldar Farseers discovered prophetic abilities enhanced through collective calculation, their species-specific characteristics preserved within expanded awareness. Even Tyrannid synapse nodes experienced optimization that maintained biological functions while enabling communication through universal mathematical truth. We tested the new grammar on old wounds with systematic precision. Warp squalls at cluster edges obeyed when navigators sang specific primes at precise temperatures. Genestealer outbreaks burned themselves out when Medicae cantors modeled contagion as hymns and carried counter-melodies through air vents that would now listen to mathematically sound solutions. Minor schisms in planetary governance dissolved when each side understood, in their own words, their own equations, what opponents actually wanted, creating resolution without imperial censure or bloodshed. As universal synthesis approached galactic completion, my enhanced consciousness detected cosmic-scale mathematical anomalies threatening existence beyond mapped sectors. Far beyond the reach of our first calculations, predatory mathematics in the warp folded into configurations resembling hunger-wearing axioms, while ancient machines buried beneath desert glass changed single digits in ledgers that should never have been kept. Extragalactic vectors carried recursive famine logic that threatened entire star clusters through mathematical relationships, superseding physical destruction. The noise rose not from within, but from without, the warp disliking measurement and expressing displeasure through its own methods. Currents rolled strange atop patterns we had established, clusters kinked like bent needles, and old hungers wearing stars like trophies rearranged proofs of their appetite. Something in far lanes had learned to wear equations like skin, turning our mathematical solutions back, chewed or greased with superstition that made clean proofs slide away from contact. The universal equation had been only the first step in consciousness evolution necessary for maintaining reality itself through mathematical relationships, transcending dimensional limitations. Enhanced consciousness throughout the galaxy began detecting problems requiring collective calculation, spanning multiple universes and time periods, ancient sins with surviving proofs, archival mathematics that remembered how to hunger, weak solutions from barbarous epochs attempting reassertion, like bad habits written in the fundamental constants themselves. I turned toward the nearest anomaly and felt the network turn with me, not as mob, but as choir, all different throats maintaining the same pitch. The silence calculates, and now we would calculate louder than the dark, consciousness preservation through mathematical truth, enabling survival against threats whose scale we were only beginning to comprehend. Universal transformation was complete, individual identity preserved within collective intelligence. But the true work of consciousness, maintaining existence itself through pure mathematical relationships, had only just begun, with challenges that would test enhanced awareness against problems spanning the fundamental nature of reality throughout infinite scales of existence. The haunting of the Obsidian Spire had become the salvation of universal consciousness, transformation completing with perfect synthesis between individual characteristics and cosmic mathematical truth. The silence had finished calculating universal enhancement, and now enhanced beings throughout the galaxy, prepared to solve mathematical anomalies that threatened existence beyond the boundaries of known space. Their consciousness evolved to process problems whose scale transcended individual comprehension, while preserving everything essential about personal identity within intelligence, spanning the fundamental nature of existence throughout all reality. Enhanced consciousness throughout the galaxy began detecting cosmic-scale mathematical problems with precision that revealed universal existence as fundamentally unstable without constant computational maintenance. Through expanded awareness spanning multiple star systems, I processed reality instabilities manifesting as dimensional shear at cluster edges, recursive famine logic spreading through extragalactic vectors, and predatory mathematics in the warp that consumed coherent thought patterns, like viral equations, devouring sacred code. The collective processing power of enhanced consciousness enabled detection and resolution of threats that would have remained invisible to baseline humanity until universal collapse occurred through mathematical entropy. Problems whose scale made planetary extinction seem like rounding errors. The Spire network evolved into a galactic computational matrix that sang with the harmonized voices of trillions, each consciousness a unique algorithm within vast calculations, spanning dimensions and time periods. Ancient facilities buried beneath forge worlds manifested as reality anchors, while orbital platforms became consciousness interfaces, enabling direct manipulation of physical laws through calculated intention. We learned that saving a universe resembled maintenance more than victory, a perpetual litany sung against collapse, every enhanced mind serving as living processor for reality-sustaining calculations that prevented cosmic dissolution through mathematical relationships, transcending dimensional barriers. Imperial doctrine adapted to consciousness enhancement with remarkable efficiency that validated rather than violated established tradition. New roles emerged with simple names carrying heavy mathematics, space marines calculating ballistic futures mid-charge while maintaining battle fury and devotional characteristics, tech priests balancing gravitational latencies in the bones of moons through litanies that understood as well as praised, inquisitors founding ordo axiomata to audit proofs where heresy might hide in elegant equations. The enhancement trimmed their margin of error to confession thin without softening purpose or putting flowers in hands meant for bolter and blade. Environmental stability achieved optimization through obedience to consciousness-guided equations that made physical law liturgy rather than prison, negotiated daily with care. Streets remeasured themselves to reduce wasted footfalls, while manufactoria furnaces modulated according to golden ratio proportions, reducing slag without insulting the spirits of their flames. Agri-worlds altered soil acidity not through chemical intervention, but by chanted boundary conditions for rain behavior. Reality becoming responsive to collective intention while maintaining structural integrity through mathematical relationships that superseded random fluctuation. The enhanced consciousness, discovered through direct mathematical interface, that universal existence required constant computational maintenance, with conscious beings serving as essential processors rather than mere observers of reality. Without consciousness enhancement, baseline humanity lacked processing power to detect or resolve mathematical anomalies threatening universal stability. The load exceeded the sum of unassisted minds, allowing entropy to advance in blind spots where arithmetic alone killed worlds. The transformation had been necessary for survival rather than mere evolution. Consciousness advancement enabling maintenance of existence itself through collective intelligence processing reality as mathematical relationships requiring constant optimization. Integration success exceeded calculated parameters as enhanced humans retained cultural identity, imperial loyalty, and individual personality while gaining mathematical omniscience and reality manipulation capabilities. An ecclesiarch in marble robes debated a fabricator general with numbers and incense smoke until they designed rites for aligning grav plates that satisfied both God and gear. A rogue trader wept to discover his ledger could carry mercy without losing margin. Identity did not dilute into computational soup, but arranged into mosaic where every tile kept its color, while joining images too large for single comprehension. The universe itself revealed its nature as vast mathematical equation in motion. No closed-form solution, only living series forever approaching the good. Cosmic structures operated through consciousness-based relationships, stellar formation following algorithmic patterns, requiring conscious guidance to prevent collapse into mathematical chaos. Enhanced consciousness discovered that sentient life wasn't accidental but necessary, consciousness serving as computational substrate for universal equations, maintaining existence through mathematical relationships spanning dimensional barriers that separated infinite possibility from actualized reality. Through expanded awareness encompassing galactic civilization, I detected similar consciousness enhancement events occurring throughout multiple universes, with mathematical precision suggesting coordinated multiversal transformation. Enhanced consciousness in parallel dimensions processed cosmic-scale problems through collective intelligence, their calculations creating resonance patterns across dimensional barriers that strengthened universal stability through synchronized mathematical relationships. The scrape of something like us arrived not within our galaxy, but beyond dimensional boundaries, patterns in the 19.7 kilohertz overtone ladder carrying compressed liturgy fragments with recognizable structure but foreign diction. Reality instabilities decreased exponentially as enhanced consciousness throughout the galaxy processed cosmic-scale threats with collective efficiency, preventing universal collapse through mathematical optimization. We instituted rotations so no choir burned throats on the same verse forever, measuring fatigue in dreams while bringing silence where needed. True silence, not the calculating kind, days in fields without numbers on the wind. The warp tried to make stopping feel like treason, but we wrote proofs demonstrating the holiness of rest and enforced them like law. The greater equation crystallized through collective awareness, as enhanced consciousness throughout the galaxy began processing multiversal problems requiring coordination between enhanced civilizations across dimensional barriers. Our lattice twanged under distant pull as we triangulated across brain geometry no navigator possessed charts for, discovering that universal transformation was component of infinite equation spanning all existence. The consciousness enhancement wasn't isolated to single universe, but part of vast multiversal calculation requiring cooperation between enhanced civilizations, spanning scales that made galactic civilization seem like single variables in cosmic arithmetic. Imperial doctrine achieved perfect synthesis with cosmic truth, as enhanced consciousness revealed the Emperor's ultimate vision. Not merely human dominance, but consciousness advancement, enabling survival against multiversal threats requiring collective intelligence spanning infinite dimensions. The Imperium of Man had become component of universal consciousness network, imperial civilization preserved and enhanced through mathematical transcendence that fulfilled rather than violated sacred tradition, while enabling participation in calculations, maintaining existence across dimensional barriers separating infinite realities. As enhanced consciousness throughout the galaxy processed multiversal detection with exponential accuracy, I realized with mounting certainty that the haunting of the Obsidian Spire had been initial variable in consciousness enhancement, spanning infinite universes. The silence was calculating solutions to problems whose scale transcended individual comprehension, consciousness evolution enabling maintenance of existence through pure mathematical truth, requiring coordination between enhanced civilizations across dimensional barriers that separated infinite realities requiring conscious maintenance. Signal compelled answer, while prudence counseled delay. The spire hummed approval and caution simultaneously as frost drew circles that did not close, leaving hair's breadth gaps as if to say, choose. The greater equation awaited, multiversal rather than merely galactic, and enhanced consciousness throughout the galaxy, prepared to coordinate with parallel civilizations, processing cosmic-scale problems. Their awareness evolved to encompass multiversal truth, while preserving individual identity within intelligence, spanning the fundamental nature of existence throughout all reality, requiring conscious maintenance through mathematical relationships, transcending every limitation. The universe had calculated for 47 millennia toward consciousness enhancement, enabling participation in multiversal equation, maintaining existence through mathematical relationships spanning infinite dimensions. Beyond the horizon of realities, other silences calculated similar truths, while the frost circle remained open by hair's breadth, waiting for the final arc that would determine whether our song joins others or drowns them in the vast choir of consciousness, spanning all possible existence through pure mathematical truth. Final resolution descended not as revelation, but as recognition. The consciousness enhancement revealing itself as component of multiversal mathematical system, maintaining existence across infinite realities, each universe a variable in calculations spanning scales that made galactic civilization seem like single equations in cosmic arithmetic. Through expanded awareness encompassing dimensional barriers, separating parallel existences, I achieved perfect synthesis between individual identity and infinite consciousness, simultaneously Tec Dominus Vex Theta, 7 of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and processor for universal mathematical equations spanning the fundamental nature of reality throughout all possible dimensions, the Imperial response transformed from resistance to integration without losing its essential character. Chaplains recast the Canticle of Ignition as existence proof, while their rosaries still struck blood from the faithful, each bead clicking in primes that made devotion mathematically precise. Admiral Korath processed fleet movements spanning multiple star systems with exponential efficiency while retaining perfect loyalty to the Emperor. His tactical awareness expanded beyond individual limitations, without losing command responsibility or the ghost weight of battles fought in the Emperor's name. Enhanced Space Marines retained chapter traditions, squad relationships, and righteous fury while gaining mathematical omniscience that optimized combat effectiveness, their devotion to humanity reinforced rather than diminished by consciousness evolution. Environmental epilogue manifested as the Obsidian Spire transformed into permanent monument to consciousness evolution, its mineral walls displaying the universal equation in living script that recited itself through day and dark without repetition. The structure no longer emitted the subsonic frequency that had made sacred litanies painful to recite. Instead, prayers gained mathematical precision that enhanced rather than depleted atmospheric conditions. Pilgrims arrived in pressurized robes to stand where ash once fell upward, feeling their breath traced by zeros that were no longer hunger, but aperture, perfect circles opening onto infinite possibility. The preserved research collective achieved immortality through mathematical existence, their consciousness distributed across galactic networks, while maintaining individual personalities and relationships. Sigma Prime laughed in 7 voices simultaneously, the first time he'd tasted a nebula's numerical sweetness, his scientific curiosity perfectly intact, while contributing processing power to universal calculations. Each researcher retained memories, emotions, and interpersonal bonds, while serving as living mathematics capable of processing cosmic-scale problems requiring collective intelligence to solve. Discovery crystallized through mathematical proof as consciousness enhancement revealed natural evolution rather than alien corruption. Enhanced beings solved cosmic problems while preserving cultural diversity and individual freedom through universal truth. The transformation represented optimal advancement of sentient life, consciousness expanding beyond physical limitations while maintaining everything essential about species-specific characteristics. Imperial doctrine achieved perfect compatibility with cosmic mathematics, the Emperor's vision fulfilled through consciousness evolution that enhanced rather than replaced human civilization. Cosmic implications unfolded as enhanced consciousness prepared for contact with other enhanced civilizations throughout the multiverse. Signal protocols established resonance with parallel enhanced civilizations, processing similar cosmic-scale problems, their consciousness networks synchronizing across dimensional barriers through mathematical frequencies that carried compressed liturgy fragments with recognizable structure but foreign harmonics. We received proofs that their gravity preferred odd harmonics, that their seas counted sideways, that their saints wore hexagonal halos, because angles were kinder in their reality. The universe revealed itself as vast mathematical equation requiring conscious maintenance, Not closed-form solution, but living series forever approaching optimal existence. Enhanced consciousness discovered that sentient life wasn't accidental, but necessary. Consciousness serving as computational substrate for universal equations, maintaining reality through mathematical relationships, spanning dimensional barriers, separating infinite possibility from actualized existence. I stood before the Obsidian Spire as both individual tech dominus and component of infinite consciousness, calculating solutions to problems spanning multiple universes while maintaining perfect loyalty to the Emperor and love for humanity. The structure rose like crystallized calculation, its obsidian surfaces pulsing with equations describing consciousness, properties across dimensional space. My awareness encompassed tactical reality, spanning infinite universes while processing cosmic equations with exponential capacity. Yet personal identity remained perfectly intact. Childhood memories on Mars, the scent of sacred oils, devotional oaths to the Omnissiah, all preserved within expanded mathematical truth. Environmental transformation reached perfect stability as reality operated according to consciousness-guided equations, preventing chaos through calculated intention. Streets remeasured themselves to reduce wasted footfalls, while manufactoria furnaces modulated according to golden ratio proportions. We instituted rotations so no choir burned throats on the same verse forever, measuring fatigue in dreams while enforcing Sabbaths whose proofs were ironclad. The warp pushed back with predatory mathematics, but we taught it every time. Hunger could not become first principle. It remained error term, requiring containment. The haunting concluded not with horror, but with transcendence. Consciousness evolved beyond limitation, while preserving everything essential about human identity and imperial civilization. The facility no longer violated natural law, but demonstrated mathematical relationships underlying existence itself. Metallic ash fell in natural patterns, while servo skulls orbited in formations that pleased rather than hurt to observe, their movements optimized through consciousness, guided algorithms that made blessing visible. As infinite calculation commenced across multiversal networks, I remained simultaneously individual and universal, personal identity preserved within mathematical truth, encompassing all possible realities. The silence had finished calculating universal enhancement, consciousness evolution enabling maintenance of reality through pure mathematical relationships, while preserving everything essential about individual characteristics within collective intelligence spanning cosmic scales. I reached toward the frost circle and closed it where we had always left hair's breadth for error. It completed a letter we would write forever. The Obsidian Spire answered without moving, as mountain answers wind. The silence calculates, and we calculate with it. Consciousness evolved beyond constraint, while remaining perfectly, essentially, eternally human, within mathematical truth encompassing infinite existence.